We are in Egypt, and we just recorded a podcast in front of the pyramids talking all about podcasting. Guys, if you want to learn about how to start a podcast, how to grow a podcast, everything that you shouldn't be doing and should be doing, come listen today. Hey there, my name's Danny Leibrandt, and you are listening to Local Marketing Secrets, where we learn the secrets from the top people in local marketing. Today I am in Egypt with Dennis. You know this is not a fake background. These are the legit pyramids of Egypt. We decided to go on a trip like we do. We like to travel a lot together.
That's the Sphinx down there. You see that right there?
Yeah. No, it's really an insane background. And, we figured, while we're traveling around, we went to London, we went to Athens. We were in Athens, might as well go to Cairo, Egypt. So excited to be here. This is both our first time in Egypt, really incredible background, and we thought, why not do a podcast here? So really excited to do this podcast with Dennis. And for those of you who somehow don't know Dennis, we've actually already done 3 podcasts together. So make sure to go watch the first one, because that is one of my most popular podcasts. It was actually the first one we ever did, which is pretty spectacular. So that's all about the new era of SEO, everything you need to know. Mm-hmm. And it was almost a year ago now, but all the same principles still apply. And then we did 2 other ones after that. Now this is the 4th one with Dennis. So obviously Dennis is a huge guest. So glad to have him on. And I'll give him a brief introduction, although you should know Dennis by now. Hopefully you've seen those episodes. If you haven't already, go watch them. So Dennis is kind of the original search engine engineer. He worked at Yahoo about 25 years ago. He was one of the first search engine engineers there, building the analytics and being part of that first original team at Yahoo, which a lot of them then moved to Google. Dennis is very successful. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers. Go check him out on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all these different places. He's spoken at about 1,000 conferences. It might be 800 or 900. It's a lot. He's got about 50 this year, so that might get him up to that 1,000. He has had some of the biggest clients in the world. Nike, Red Bull, Adidas, Starbucks, Golden State Warriors. You name it, he's basically worked with them. Guys, Dennis is a super genius, and particularly in local marketing. He's been helping local businesses for the past 20 years. He is a super expert and, incredibly knowledgeable, has tons of courses and training on everything, and I'm so glad to have him on the podcast today.
Thank you, Danny, and I'm so glad that we're talking about local, because everywhere we've been local. We're talking about the pyramids. Mr. Beast made a video about this a few days ago, but we can talk locally about that. We can talk locally about, like, we were in Athens, we're going to Rome in a few days, and we can talk locally about what is going on there in those cities and those civilizations. But wherever you are, you can do things that are local. So I'm here with Danny and other people that are like Danny, because I want to see folks win in local. You want to be the best plumber in, Comstock, Pennsylvania, or you're a young adult in LA and you want to help cosmetic surgeons, like whatever it is locally is where you can make the biggest impact. And that's why we've made so many episodes. That's why I've spoken all over the world in those cities, in Atlanta and Chicago and Denver and these other places, because I want to create local communities, people who are helping those businesses in those cities win. Yeah.
And I think something really important to note there is that the content is in person. With the rise of AI, with all this stuff coming about, you don't really know, like I've seen friends that basically make a perfect model of themselves and it's just them in their room, whatever. But when we can do a real podcast in person in Egypt, like this is not, fake, scripted, any of that stuff. Like this is a real podcast. And I feel like as the time moves forward in the next few years, there's going to be a lot of AI content. There's going to be a lot of AI podcasts. So what we really want to promote and we want to show people is making real, authentic content, and particularly talking about podcasts today.
Yeah, and there's no better way to create a ton of content at scale if you're a local roofer or pest control company or whatnot than by filming a podcast with someone else in your local community. And because from that 45-minute, 1-hour conversation, how many pieces can you cut out of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Probably,
100%.
8 or 10 little 1-minute snippets, little stories, little topics. You have an idea of what you want to cover, but a great conversation always covers other items, and those get repurposed into social media snippets, into blog posts, into Google Business Profile things, into YouTube, and all sorts of different ways. So even something like this, what Danny and I are doing, because we're about to go to the Egypt Museum as soon as we're done recording this, it'll go into 100 pieces of content. Mm-hmm. So whether you're a young adult or you're a local service business, understand that when you make a video like this that is real, that's in depth, that the AI can't replicate, that's 100 pieces of content.
Yeah.
I saw that I had 900 something videos on just the Blitz Metrics YouTube, which is my own channel. I don't even post that much. We have 900 some because videos where I've been with other people, our team chops those up into all kinds of different pieces, largely through podcasts, because the podcast is like 100 pieces of content, right? And then that becomes everything that we ever want to talk about with the people that are already authoritative. The podcast is, I don't care if you're a young adult or you're a landscaper or whatever, you should have a podcast.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd like to back up for a second here. Why exactly is a podcast so important?
A podcast establishes your reputation, your expertise, and it frames who you are without coming off as selling. So if you have some kind of mission, you want to be known as a professional dunker like Dylan Haugen, this guy's interviewed all the top people in professional dunking to establish his name. Instead of just saying, I'm a great dunker. Instead of having the AI generate, oh, here's a bunch of videos on how to do a 360 between the legs or something like that. But he actually has real experience interviewing, you know, the Jordan Kilgannons and the Isaiah Riveras and you name all the people in his industry, right? And that way, he doesn't have to be the one to come up with all the topics or be interesting because he's putting the burden on all the other people who are the best in that industry. So whatever you want to be known for, you can go to the top people in that industry like Danny has in the world of local SEO. He's already hit the who's who, right? And it's not even based on his expertise because it's already to draw on the expertise and the experience of all those other people. So a podcast is the best way to build your perceived authority, to build your networking, to do all these things that are more effective than selling where you don't ever have to sell. If you're a nobody, the podcast is also the best angle that you should take.
Definitely. And I think something important to note here is that overall, no matter what it is, podcasts, whatever you're doing, people learn by association. So the fact that you have a podcast, it's not just like, you know, maybe you took a selfie at a conference. There is an hour-long conversation of you talking with this expert in the field, and ideally in person like we're doing now. That is so powerful, and that shows that that person is willing to come on your podcast. They're willing to be associated with you because also most top people in whatever space understand that coming on a podcast isn't just like a random thing. You are now associating yourself with them and with that podcast. So in terms of that, when you have all the top people in your industry on a podcast, that kind of by proxy makes you one of the authorities in the space.
And then the thing is, a lot of people might say, well, you know, Neil Patel, if I ask him, why he wouldn't want to be on my podcast or so-and-so. And we find these people actually will. So like Danny said, when those people say yes, that's a window of associated mutual. It's basically an endorsement.
Yeah,
if they're willing to be with you on Zoom or even better in person or at a conference, you meet these people or you run into them at Starbucks. You know, hopefully they're not too busy at that point. You're not interrupting them. But that sort of implied endorsement is huge. And I think the podcast is one step towards like public speaking or being on TV, but you don't have to have a huge name and there's not the risk of being on live TV.
Yeah.
So if you want to build a reputation, the podcast is the best way to do that because the podcast can be turned into a book, you know, all the different chapters of the people that you've interviewed. There's so many different things that you can do.
Yeah, and I'm actually such a big advocate for podcasts. Not only are we recording one right now and I have, you know, months scheduled out, I'm actually going to start another podcast just for my agency. So this is originally my agency podcast. Now I've expanded because I've gotten on some bigger guests and it kind of just made sense. I'm like, I was talking with Dennis, I was like, dude, do you think I should just start another podcast just making it all about pest control and then have like the #1 podcast in pest control? And then for my agency, now all the pest control guys associate me with pest control expertise. And I can be the #1 guy in pest control digital marketing by associating with all the top people in pest control. And now all the top people in pest control know me, they're watching the podcast. And when people originally find out about the podcast, they're not watching it for you, they're watching it for the guests. And I think that's also something important, is that it's not that you're a big deal, but it's that you're having on big deals, or at least a big deal to people. And it doesn't have to be like a Neil Patel or even a Dennis Yu, but someone that is an expert in the industry that you want to specialize in. So, you know, I'm gonna start the pest control podcast soon, and I don't know, I'm sure most of you guys don't even know who these pest control people are, but the pest control people do, and that's what matters.
Yeah, same way, Eric Van Horn, you probably don't know who that is, but that's the #1 guy in franchising. So he's advising all these other guys who have 100 locations, 200 locations, they're looking to buy into a franchise. And Eric and I being together is, I mean, if all the people that follow Eric Van Horn who are into franchising, what kind of franchise do I open? Should, you know, they're gonna know who that is. He's already ranking on the top franchise terms. He's already speaking at the top franchise conferences. He's already interviewed these top franchise people. So us, Eric and I being together, that automatically is a huge signal of trust. But here's a couple other follow-on things that you might not realize. One is that just because I put out a podcast on my website, channel, YouTube, whatever, with Eric Van Horn doesn't guarantee that all the people that follow and trust Eric Van Horn are going to see it, or all the people that are interested in starting a franchise. So if I take that content and I run $1 a day against the followers of Eric Van Horn on Twitter follower lookalikes, or I target people interested in franchising on LinkedIn, or I just let Facebook and TikTok be able to find other people that are interested in franchising based on who's engaging, by who's watching the video, then I'm getting 10x, 100 times the number of people that would have otherwise have seen it organically. If I'm a nobody and I interview Danny, some people will see that, some of my friends, some of his friends, but then if I put $1 a day against it, it's very clear who I serve, it's very clear who the audience is, it's very clear the topic that we're talking about. For example, with Eric, I'm going to talk about how do you succeed as a franchisor when you got many franchisees and they don't behave properly? How do you do local across all of them? Those people really care about that, which then sends a signal to the different algorithms to attract more people that are like that. Then the second follow-on effect is, I saw Caleb Williams 2 weeks ago, he had Eric Van Horn on his podcast. And I've been on Caleb's podcast. Caleb's been on my podcast. I'm seeing Caleb in 2 weeks in Nashville to be able to interview him again. But then people who follow Caleb's a financial advisor. He advises he's the lighthouse in financial advisors. All the financial advisors know who he is, like the life insurance people. And then Eric Van Horn, who's also, and Caleb and Eric have talked about money and financing and investing, and when you start a business, your franchise, how do you, all the financial things, which Caleb's well known for. That is an incredible combo, because now people who are friends of Caleb, who have seen that I've been hanging out with Caleb and are friends with Eric, it's all well, dang, Dennis is friends with Caleb and with Eric and with Danny, and then they see we're all on each other's podcasts. Whatever it is that you have to sell also translates, that just builds trust for everybody. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, again, it ties back to the associations, like I was saying. And also kind of a hack within this, which I didn't think about when I was starting a podcast, and I'm sure most other people don't as well. But what's happened for me with the podcast is several guests that I've had on the podcast, I don't know what it is of the law of reciprocation, or maybe they actually like me, or we're cool now, but they want to have me on their podcast now. So it goes both ways, like you were saying, where I can even not be a big name in digital marketing or local marketing, whatever it is, but because I had them on my podcast, they're like, oh, I really like Danny. Okay, he's got some niche expertise in this field. Okay, I would love to have him on, and it makes sense. He had me on mine. I'm gonna have him on his. That law of reciprocation there, it's actually kind of a hack to make podcast appearances as well.
It's the best way to do networking, to be able to do business development. If you want to do sales or get more clients for your agency, or you want to be better known in an area or category, or you want to be a public speaker or whatever it is, this podcasting mutual introduction thing is so huge. Because when I'm with Danny, for example, and we're talking about, let's say, for young adults on how they scale up local SEO and use these different tools and whatnot, we can take this and boost it to other young adults or other people who have software or programs that help young adults be successful and local. And so that helps my mission, that helps his mission. It's like this massive networking at scale, because there's so many different ways you can use it, and it draws in so many other people that are well known. In fact, you interviewed Wyatt Chambers, and I think he also had you on his podcast, which is a good sign that it was, if your podcast is good and they liked it, then they have you on their podcast, that's a sign that it was good, right? And then what happens? Wyatt Chambers reaches out to me, or I don't know, maybe I reached out, I think I commented on his thing on your YouTube, and then I had him on my podcast. And then all these other, now Wyatt is connected with me, and so whenever I post stuff on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatnot, he's retweeting it or sharing it on Facebook or whatnot, because we had that initial trust that was established between Danny and Wyatt, which then kind of transferred over to me, and now Wyatt and I are friends. He messaged me a few days ago saying, hey, when are you going to be in Phoenix? Because I saw you're doing this trampoline basketball dunking stuff. Can you show me how to do that? I'm like, cool, let's choose a date in the calendar. we'll go to the basketball place and I'll show you how to do these crazy dunks and all that. And now we built a friendship.
Yeah.
But that was because Danny initiated that. But then Wyatt saw that I was connected with all these other people and we had so many mutual friends, because you look someone up on LinkedIn to see how many mutual friends you have. And then like you've already won at that point.
Yeah. No, the networking effect is insane. And I think we were talking about just a day or two ago, I was, again, another thing that I was really surprised at in terms of things like value that you get from starting a podcast is that not only do I have that established connection, I have that podcast already out, but now there's an ongoing friendship and relationship with these people. So what I've noticed on places like LinkedIn, Facebook, sometimes Twitter, but really LinkedIn and Facebook are the main two, is that the people that I'm having on the podcast, I am interacting with them regularly now. And the only reason is because I had them on the podcast. So big people like Josh Nelson, big people like Joy Hawkins, other large people in the space, I am interacting with them regularly. And it's just because, like, it's really, I can't even fathom it. Like, Josh Nelson is commenting on my post. Mike Blumenthal just replied to a comment that I did on a Darren Shaw post.
That's huge.
I am associated with Darren Shaw and Mike Blumenthal and Joy and
You're
Josh.
not trying to name drop, but he literally you have the who's who in local.
Yeah, no, every single person in local SEO, and now it's gone into local marketing. So really, the networking is insane. And also, all these people tell me on and off camera, dude, anything you need, I'm here to help, because I start from a giving first mentality. You know, I really praise them at the beginning, like I did at the beginning of this podcast, and saying, you know, Dennis is so awesome, which he is, which is why I'm having him on the podcast and why I'm having all these other people on the podcast. But make it clear that that's the first thing, is making sure that there's a value add. You know, Dennis is so awesome, you know, he's done this, and that. And then also at the end, what I make sure to do is promote them. You know, what social media platforms are you on? What services do you provide? Tell me more about the services. Like, usually in most podcasts, I tell them, like, tell me all about your agency. Tell me what the onboarding looks like. Like, if someone wants to work with them and they watch the podcast, they watch the podcast and they want to work with them, it's very easy and very clear. And then I also say, hey, all the links are in the description. Go, please contact them. You know, go work with this person. Anything else you'd like to plug or mention? Anything that you're missing. Well, since you won't mention it, I'll mention it. I see that you have the school group. Do you want people to go, like, making sure that you're adding as much value as possible, especially when you're just starting out, you know, maybe you're a younger guy, or maybe you are just starting a local business, that you're adding as much value as possible so that they in turn will return that value.
Incredible. I mean, think about all the follow-on kinds of business and the things that emanate when you as the podcast host are elevating someone else. If you have to talk about your own stuff, you look like a douchebag, right? But when someone else, so you had Greg Gifford on your podcast, and I think you'd like barely even launched your podcast.
It was episode 5,
And freaking got Greg Gifford on the podcast, and I'm thinking, I've been in local since the beginning, and I've known Greg for 20 years. I haven't even had Greg Gifford on my podcast yet. And I was with him in Romania a few months ago, because we go to all these conferences and, you know, we hang out and all that. And I think he said something like, dude, Danny Leibrandt had me on the podcast, and he was saying some good things, and I'm thinking like, oh, that Danny guy, he's like several steps even ahead of me, you know? But the fact that Greg is thinking, because Greg's been interviewed on all kinds of podcasts and stages, but the fact that he references, Danny Leibrandt did a really good job on his podcast, that tells me it stands out because Danny has put in the time to research that guest and elevate the guest. And I try to do like what Danny's doing, where, hey, I'm with Sal Sciorda today, and we're in Easton, Pennsylvania, and this guy grew his plumbing business because of his dad and all this, and he's a firefighter, and all these great stories. And so when I'm elevating Sal Sciorda, then he of course wants to share that, because it's like, if you get an award, you want to tell everyone like, hey, look, I got this award. So when you're the podcast host, put in the time to do the research so that you can say good things about those other people, because they're more likely to share it. Plus, it shows your viewers this is an episode worth listening to.
Yeah, like I said, I always make sure to elevate the guests, not just because of that networking effect, but so that people listen all the way through. Like, you'll see different YouTube stats, and also because I started out as a copywriter, I know that the first little portion of any content that you do is the most important. So I make sure at the very beginning, you know, I get right into it, that there's no like insane intro, or I don't, you know, talk about myself or what the podcast is for a while. You know, Danny Leibrandt, here's the podcast, here's what it is. Okay, now here's the guest. And I make sure to talk about how big of a deal they are so that people will listen throughout the podcast. Because I've actually seen several podcasts, particularly recently, it might have been, I think it was a Tucker Carlson one, and he didn't do any introduction. He just said, hey, so glad to have you here. Let's jump in. And I looked at the comments because I always like to look at the YouTube comments, and almost all of them, particularly all of the top ones, were, dude, please introduce your guest. I have no idea who this guy is. Yeah. And by the way, I was thinking the same thing. That was part of why I went to the YouTube comments. It's like, who even is this guy? Why should I listen through?
Yeah. And then that hurts you algorithmically from YouTube and whatever, because whoever's watching is what drives more people that it sends traffic to. Even, arguably the number one guy in Silicon Valley in startups is Robert Scoble. And he's done thousands of interviews, you name it, right? Yeah. And the first thing he does when he sits down with the guest is he says, who are you? Right? He's sitting down with Elon Musk, he's sitting down with Branson, he's sitting down with the CEO of Google and all that. This guy, Robert Scoble, is probably the biggest name when it comes to podcasting and blogging. And even still, he makes sure to introduce, obviously if you're with Elon Musk, you're like, yeah, we're with Elon Musk. But then he has Elon Musk say, tell everyone who you are, right? Yeah. But even better than that, because that's a lazy move if you just say, oh, well, I don't need to prepare. I'll just say, okay, Danny, go ahead and introduce yourself. You also have to show that you believe to your audience that this person's worth talking to. Yeah. You have to show that you've done that research, but still have the guest say a couple things about themselves.
Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't take much research. For me, it's about an hour or so. Like that is not much. Maybe I will speed run through one of the podcasts that they've been on. I'll look at all of their socials. I'll see what they're posting. I'll see what their descriptions are. Maybe their personal website or their company website. It doesn't take much, but if you just get that hour or so in before the podcast, then you'll be really good to go after you have that. So awesome. Something else I wanted to, which really this is kind of stepping back, is I feel like at this point in this podcast, people understand how important podcasting and content is as a whole. Yeah. But I'm sure that just about everyone watching this actually doesn't have a podcast. So we're talking about all the amazing things about it. XYZ, but most people still don't have one. So I'd really like to jump into how exactly do you start a podcast, and is it super hard? What exactly do you have to do?
I've helped a lot of my friends start podcasts, and the first thing is just overcoming these myths about what a podcast is, or you need fancy equipment, or you got to be famous, or it takes a lot of time, or there's all this software to learn. So all the myths can be boiled down to, if you can just choose a topic and just use your iPhone or your Zoom account to talk to people that you like, that tie to the topic that you care about, that tie to something that ideally creates value for you, your product or service, then you've got a podcast. And then you can go to ChatGPT and say, help me name a podcast. This is what I do. These are kind of my friends, and I want to make it around, this kind of thing. What do I call it? Like my buddy Jack Wendt, who just started a company called High Rise Influence. What should his podcast be called? What should his book be called? Who should he have on his podcast? And you ask the AI, so what do you know about me? And who are the other people that you've seen me on podcasts? Now, if you've not been on podcasts or you haven't, whatever, then you won't have any, or where have I spoken? But if there's enough information about who you are, who is Danny Leibrandt, right? That gives you a sense. And the key is if you can literally just decide what's the topic you want to have, that naturally leads to who are the guests and how do you create value, because you're interviewing them about how they achieved a certain kind of success, which of course implies that you are also part of that and you help other people achieve that success. If you can do that one thing, like I was with, I'll give you one example, with Seth Jordan a couple weeks ago. We were in Miami. This guy's a fashion model or whatever, and social media influencer guy. And he had never created long form content because it had always been like Nike or whatever brands would pay him to do these things or pay him to manage the social media behind the scenes. And I said, well, actually I interviewed him on my podcast for like 10 minutes at the beach. And then I said, but you should have a podcast. He's like, oh no, but this, that, and all these excuses. I'm like, no, just like, what would it be about? Well, what do you care about? He said, well, I want to help a bunch of young adults be able to succeed and understand how to use social media to make their first social media dollar. I said, you just said it right there. Your podcast is your first social media dollar.
That's a good name.
Yeah, I thought that was really good. And then I said, you know what? We're already here. I already put my iPhone on the tripod like we have here. Why don't you just go ahead and interview me? And then just start out. Yeah, but I don't know how. And then I said, okay, be like this. Hey guys, today it's Seth Jordan, and on your first social media dollar, today we've got Dennis Yu, and he's done a lot in digital and blah, blah, blah. Dennis, how did you make your first social media dollar? Well, Seth, what I did was I started making these websites, and then I realized this and that, and people started paying me, and then more people like that started paying me, and then pretty soon all these things happened. And then we had this whole conversation, right? And then we were with Warren Whitlock, right? And Warren can talk for hours and hours. And we got on a Zoom, because I pinged him on Facebook, Warren. He's got 1 million followers on Twitter and whatnot. And I said, Warren, do you want to be on Seth's podcast, your first social media dollar? And he's like, well, of course, Dennis, I'm happy to be on his podcast. And I sent him a Zoom link, because on Zoom, you click the thing and it generates the Zoom link right there. Interviewed him. And then within 72 hours, we already had 3 podcast episodes live on his website, using our platform, which generates personal brand websites, on his YouTube, on his Facebook. And he had to create, I think, a LinkedIn or a Facebook. He had to dig to find his Facebook account from years ago, because I know old people like me are on Facebook instead of Instagram. But literally, and now, a week and a half, 2 weeks later, he's got tons and tons of episodes. And it's like he never, why would he ever look back? Because now everyone he's running into, he can literally do like a 1-minute thing. Have you ever seen those people like on YouTube or on Instagram, where you walk up to the guy who's got a fancy car, like, hey, how did you make your first? Well, I started real estate. Hey, how did you get a house? Like, oh, well, I sold my company, and so that's what he's done with all these people that are well known, because he knows a lot of influencers, so he can go to them and say, hey, real quick, how did you make your first social media dollar? On today's episode, we have so and so, right? And it's literally that easy.
Yeah, and if it was 1 minute like that, I mean, you could do 100 a week. Like, a lot of this is mental barriers that people are facing. And when we were talking about starting, guys, this applies to business, it applies to whatever you want to do. You just have to start. You can go take a look at my initial podcast, which, I started a year ago at this point. Take a look at my initial podcast. They were kind of tough. I mean, we used your studio for, I think, the 2 initial ones that we did. I think that's episode 1 and 4.
Yeah.
But some of those initial ones, guests that you don't really know. I mean, Greg Gifford was big. I was using, a basic webcam. The first 2 after the one that we did was with my laptop camera. Yeah. And by the way, you were talking about like coming up with a fancy name.
Yeah.
The name for my podcast originally was the Pest Control SEO Podcast. Yeah. Like it was just based on my agency. Yeah. Because, I wanted to build my agency brand and all of that. And I mean, if you have a good agency name, that works. But the Pest Control SEO Podcast, that doesn't really work. But regardless,
you started.
The most important thing is getting that content out there. Yeah. Because I've rebranded the podcast, I think it's 3 times at this point, which actually I forgot to mention at the beginning of this episode, that now I've switched it to Local Marketing Secrets. So it was the Pest Control SEO Podcast, then it was the Local Marketeer, then I was thinking maybe the Local Marketeer Podcast, because I want to turn that into a company, and now it's Local Marketing Secrets. But I can do that, I can literally just change the name, but still all of the content is still there. So really stop thinking so much about all the thumbnails, all of the titles, just start interviewing people. It's going to kind of suck at the beginning, you're going to have no idea what you're doing. Maybe you can start out with some kind of rougher guests that maybe aren't as well known, that maybe you're not so scared to reach out to. Maybe it's just a friend in the industry that's a little bit ahead of you, but just start outreaching to people, start getting that content going, start getting it published, and then you can improve from there.
Amen. Literally, just overcome that mental barrier. I don't care how old or young you are, whether you're poor, you're in school, you're in Africa, just get the thing going, because like Danny, he started out Pest Control SEO Podcast. I mean, whatever. He later changed it, but by getting momentum and having these guests and building connections and learning and having fun, if you didn't take those first steps, it wouldn't have opened up all these opportunities you otherwise wouldn't have seen.
Yeah, exactly. So really, you can only learn once doing, where everyone's trying to create it perfectly the first time. Like we were just at this guy's place, about a week ago, and he's had his podcast studio for like 2 years, and he was just recording some of his first songs. I was like, dude, I mean, I was recording it like in my bedroom at home, like just on the side with my laptop camera. So again, just start getting the content going, and you can improve from there. Like, now my podcast is actually pretty sound, and there are all these different aspects, which I know people are so scared about, getting the thumbnails right, the titles right. I didn't really start to get things dialed in until really like episode 30 or 40. Like it's really just been in the past few episodes where I've got my setup right, my microphone right, recording with my phone instead of with my computer, which, by the way, you don't need a $2,000 camera. I'm using my iPhone, which, I use every day, and I'm sure you have a decent iPhone or whatever phone that you use.
You're watching this on my iPhone. Yeah, this is my iPhone. I pulled it out of my pocket, put it on a cheap tripod, and this is what you're looking at.
Yeah, it's so simple.
It's a $200 microphone. This is the DJI Mic 2, which allows two people to be able to do this thing, good sound. That's all you have to do. It's so simple.
It's so simple. So let's jump to another aspect of podcasting then, is how do you reach out to people? How do you get decent people on your podcast?
Well, I don't really reach out because they reach out to me because I've been on their podcast first. But for those of you guys who haven't done that, it's literally this simple. When you reach out to them on whatever the channel is, actually the best thing is you comment on one of their podcast episodes on YouTube. YouTube likes to send notifications. And you say, Danny, I saw your episode 43 with Neil Patel on local marketing secrets, and I really liked how you guys talked about this and that. And I have a podcast on insert the thing, and I wanted to ask you some questions about this. I've had this guy, and this guy on my podcast, and I think it would really benefit your audience and mine, right, to have you. And I can guarantee 10,000 views on that podcast. I'll be in and out in 30 minutes. What do you say?
Yeah.
And they all always say yes to that, right?
Yeah.
If they're a really big deal, they'll have an assistant, but then the assistant will come back and say, okay, cool, yeah, send us the booking link. Now, if you write this thing that's a mile long and include a booking link, they're going to assume you're trying to sell IT services or something like that. Don't do that. So literally just say, you say something specific. I love the episode 48 that you had where you talked about this and that with this other person. I'd love to have you on my podcast to talk about insert related topic. I've had person A, B, and C on my podcast before, which are people that they would respect, ideally people they've interviewed or vice versa to show like you're legit. If you do that, you've won. Now, if you have not interviewed all these other people, then you just say, look, I guarantee you 10,000 views on the podcast because I'm going to edit it and promote it and whatever. Interview some of your friends, interview other people just to get a couple episodes out before you reach out to someone who might be whatever. But if you have a mutual friend, that person might be willing to just go ahead and have you, be on your podcast anyway. I tend to believe you got to get just 2 or 3 of these in. It could even be something, it doesn't even have to be like, it could be like me and Danny in front of the pyramids, right? Just something, get something out there so they get a sense of who you are, your vibe, what you like to talk about. You can even have your mom interview you about, oh, son, why did you start this company? Oh, because your mom obviously believes you're amazing, right? Outreach does not have to be this complicated kind of thing. It can be as simple as an Instagram, DM saying, hey, bro, I'd love to have you on my podcast to talk about this thing. And that's probably enough.
Yeah. And by the way, most people are receptive to this, assuming, so usually it'll be reaching out through some kind of social media. I use LinkedIn the most to reach out to people to get on the podcast. If someone is very clearly more active on Facebook, then I'll do it on Facebook. But usually LinkedIn, just about all of the people that are serious about business and serious about podcasting and are willing to get on podcasts are usually on LinkedIn. So I always love reaching out on LinkedIn. And like you said, adding some kind of personalization and showing that you care, you did some research. So, maybe commenting on their podcast or saying, like I've done this for probably at least 10 of the guests that I've reached out to, saying, hey, I just basically what you said, I just watched this podcast that you were on, absolutely loved it. I think that was spot on what you said about social media or about whatever. And that shows like, dude, you actually care, and you already did some research, because that's sometimes that's what people are concerned about is like, oh, dude, you didn't do any research, you have no idea who I am, what I do. It's like, no, dude, I know all about you. I just binge watched 3 podcasts, and I absolutely love you, and I'd love to have you on my podcast. That is super powerful.
Because you've shown the respect, instead of just saying, oh, you have a great podcast, which can be like a canned thing you send to everybody. So LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube are probably the 3 for business if you're interviewing entrepreneurs and whatnot. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Dallas with Richard McClure, who runs Fox Heating and Air. And he's getting all of his vans redone with this company, Kick Charge. You probably, in home services, they're the biggest. They like all the vans that are really nice with all the wraps. It's done by this company, Kick Charge, which was started by Dan Antonelli. So Richard was posting, hey, I'm so excited that I'm getting my vans redone by Dan of Kick Charge. I was on Facebook. I commented saying, dude, Dan, you're like the OG, because everyone who wants to show they have like the best vans, they all have chosen Kickcharge.
Yeah.
So obviously I said that to elevate him, because then all the other plumbers and landscapers see that I'm saying, Dan, dude, you're like the industry guy, when like there's no one better at branding and home services, which is true.
Yeah.
Right. So then he replies back to that Facebook thread and says, no, actually it's the other way around. Dennis, you're the OG of digital marketing
Yeah.
and SEO. Now all of his followers see that he's cross-endorsing me. And that's exactly what Danny just talked about on a podcast intro. We just did that. We just happened to do that in a Facebook back and forth commenting thing. And then because the vibe was so good, and other people's like, oh yeah, I hired Dan and my business has grown. Oh yeah, Dan has the best designs. And then other people were saying, oh yeah, Dennis is so good. Dennis is so good. You know, like both of his followers and my followers are commenting on that. So then that was so good. I said, Dan, you know, I've always wanted to have you on my podcast. It would be such an honor. And he said, done.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Right? LFG or something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then then I commented back and I said, you know what? I want to fly out to see you. I don't want to just do this as I will fly in. You know, we'll do the podcast in your studio or where you have all these vans or your whole team, because you've grown this $10 million a year business and whatever. And I want to just talk about how you have built brands and home service businesses for people that were nobodies, and he's got so many before and afters. It's so interesting. Do you know, for example, you know, like those vans that are the plumbers and electricians that go around, like the Mercedes Sprinter vans? He has one where like he has these cartoon characters. Like he does it for Tommy Mello too, right?
Yeah.
So he showed how clever he was, where there's, you know, like these wrap vans, there's a picture of a guy and he's like obviously like doing construction or something, but then the door handle of the van is his mustache. I'm like, that is really clever.
Yeah.
And I want to, like, Dan, show me like 10 other examples that are just like that. So it doesn't, like the outreach and sending a message on LinkedIn or whatever, yeah, that'll probably work if they're not a big deal. But the best thing is when you're commenting on a thread that they're already a part of, because then their audience sees it. And it's almost like, and then when you ask, it's like proposing in front of your fiance in front of the stadium. It's like they really can't say no at that point, right?
Yeah. No, it's so awesome.
And there's a public commitment. Everyone can see that Dan said, yeah, I'd love to be on your podcast. And dude, I would be, you know, he's saying all these good things about me. So we've already kind of started the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's insane, dude. And it's really, this is how, especially as a young guy or someone that's just getting into business, this is how you can connect with people in your space and top experts in your field. And really, like, something that I've heard a lot, from entrepreneurs that are giving advice about people just starting out, is that you should listen to your target market, that you should talk to some of the top experts, like ideally mentorship, talking to people that are like mentors and talking to people that are like clients. And the way that you can do that, like, you know, you like normally people think about that and they're like, well, how could I ever talk to Dennis? Ask him to be on your podcast.
Yeah.
Like the podcast relinquishes all of that in between. It's an excuse to talk to people. And another way I like to think of podcasts, it's like free coaching. I get to have all my favorite people in the space on the podcast. I get to ask them whatever questions I want.
Yeah.
There's not, you know, I don't have like some producer, it's not like some job where they're like, oh no, you can only ask these questions. Oh, stay away from these. Yeah. No, I can ask whatever I want. Yeah. And it's also particular to that moment. So it's like, you know, maybe I just had Josh Nelson. I'm like, oh, you know, I really, you know, I have some questions about retention. Like, you know, like how do you do like this gifting thing? How do you keep clients for like over a year or so? Yeah. It's like, I'm just going to ask Josh. I'm just going to ask the top person.
And how much would it cost to have Josh Nelson for one-on-one coaching, right?
Yeah.
This is a guy with multiple $10 million a year businesses, but he's willing to do that. So here's a hack that I think will work for you. So a couple years ago, I had kind of this health scare, right? And so I was researching ways to improve my metabolic health because my blood pressure went, like I had to go to the ER. My blood pressure went to like 200 over 110, which is like you're about to die, right? And there's this guy, Dr. Philip Ovadia, who's maybe the nation's #1 cardiologist, heart surgeon guy. He wrote a book, Stay Off My Operating Table. And so he's blown up on Twitter. So because I was doing my research, I came across some of his YouTubes and Twitters, and I started asking some questions there, because I was honestly concerned, like, how do I lower my blood pressure so I don't die, right? And he commented back, and so I asked him a couple more questions, which clearly I'm asking for my own personal self-interest on health, because I don't want to die. And then I don't know why, I just thought, Dr. Philip, I would love to have you on my podcast. Because he had answered all these questions. I'd love to have you on my podcast because there's a lot of super busy entrepreneurs that are not doing the best thing for their health, and this would be really helpful for them. And he says, why, sure, right? Because we had a great podcast. Of course, I put it out there on YouTube and articles, and I spent $1 a day on it, so we got a lot of views on YouTube and Twitter and all that. And then a couple months later, he says, hey, Dennis, I've just started a podcast, and I'd love to have you on as my first guest.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I'd love to, because now he's got all these doctors and whatever that follow him, because he's well known in that whole medical space. And then because I'm on his podcast, guess what happens? All these other top known doctors that are doing stem cell and IV and cryotherapy and HRT, what's it called, and peptides and like TRT, all the medical stuff like live forever kind of doctor things. Those doctors start commenting on my stuff because they see that Dr. Filippo Vadi and I are buds, right? And then I get to ask, like to Danny's point, I'm asking shameless questions of all the top doctors on the planet. Like, what reason do I have to talk to any?
No reason.
Why would any of these people give me the time of day?
No.
Right? I couldn't, these guys are so busy and so important, yet Dr. Filippo Vadi texts me. He says, hey Dennis, I just want to check in and see how you're doing. Send me your latest blood panel so I can analyze it. It's like,
Dang.
I can't believe he texted me. So I send him I get my blood work done every quarter because I love to look at the stats. And I send it over to him, and he says, well, this number's a little low, and this number's a little high, and you should probably do this. Like, how awesome is that? And it was only because he was on my podcast, and then all these other doctors, I honored him, and I never once promoted myself at all.
Yeah, no, podcast really is the perfect introduction to speaking to anyone you want. And another aspect of podcasting that we talked about earlier in the show, but I really want to jump into it, is that podcasts are so great to be repurposed as well and turned into all different kinds of things. So can you speak on that?
So if you have raw ingredients, so this raw iPhone video, that can be instantly with AI tools, with CapCut, Opus, Clip, Descript, all these different tools be turned into a YouTube, a blog post, a Instagram story, a LinkedIn post, a guest blog post on that other person's site, or shorts, or other kinds of derivative content. So I think of it as like Mexican food: beans, cheese, rice, ground beef. It reshapes into a burrito, tostada, enchilada, chalupa, taco, chimichanga, right? I use food analogies when I want to go eat. It's like the Geiger counter. The more often I mention food, the closer we are to about to go eat.
Yeah.
But you can take those same raw ingredients, and now you got 100 items on the Mexican restaurant menu, right? So most people think, okay, I'm going to publish it to Spotify and iTunes and whatever podcast. There's tools that will do that. But when we talk about repurposing, we're talking about how do you take that video conversation, which could be an hour long, and then turn it into bite-sized clips where there's one story at a time. Or we're talking about this one topic on today, like how do you use a podcast for local ROI? How do you start a podcast? How do you get someone to say yes if you're a nobody? How do you make money off of a podcast? How do you elevate the guest? How do you promote the podcast and those are little topics that we talked about that can be chopped up into different pieces, right? And so when you think of it in terms of what you stand for, the intersection between you and the guest, their audience and yours, how you actually deliver value based on what you do repeatedly because of your product or service, and how that intersects with how they make money and whatnot, that makes repurposing easier.
Yeah.
If you don't have clear alignment, then it's going to be very hard to do repurposing, even though technically the AI tools can chop it up into lots of different pieces.
Yeah, and this ties back to EEAT, which is really what we were talking about in the first podcast that we did, is that you want to start with real ingredients, like Dennis said. So don't just put out, I see a lot of people, maybe you're posting on Instagram or LinkedIn, it's an AI image with an AI caption. You might not think that people can tell. Guys, I can tell. I'm a copywriter, a video and photo editor and all these different aspects of social media marketing.
Yeah.
Anyone that actually knows what they're doing can tell. And I don't know, it could be a decent piece of AI content. Maybe you just got a little bit of help from a VA. But really, and particularly actually about building company brands, what I've realized, number one, is that it's easier to build a personal brand than company brand. Because personal, people feel like they can relate to you more. So you can put out a little bit of AI content and people still kind of feel like they can connect with you because they know it's from you. But from a company brand aspect, how do people relate to you? How do people connect to you? How do they relate to that AI image? It's like, if you're the local pest control company and you're just posting AI images every week, is that relatable? Does anyone want to connect with that? So kind of a key that I've seen, I've heard almost no one talk about this, is that in order to jump that barrier of people being able to establish that relationship and connection with your brand, you need to be putting out real content, and ideally not just photos, even though photos are great, but video content, because that's how we jump all the way there and establish that connection with our audience, whereas we couldn't with just like AI photos.
Amen. I think of a podcast as co-created video content. It's you and someone else who's an expert. You guys are having a conversation that you think would be interested to people that follow both of you, and then that can be turned into any. So I think of, literally, we were at the Vatican Museum a few months ago. We're going to go back there in 3 days from now in Italy, where all the greatest treasured artwork, religious artifacts, paintings, all that kind of stuff was there. And we made a video, we were waiting in line to get in, and we made a video right there, and that is a podcast. I think of everything as a podcast, because if it's co-created content where someone else, you're interviewing them or you're sharing expertise, that can be repurposed into all kinds of other. A podcast doesn't have to be gigantic microphone in front of you in the studio, Joe Rogan 3 hours talking about something. I know. It can be anything. But the point is that the essence of you are with someone else, you guys are discussing a particular thing of interest to a particular audience, you name specifically the audience that you name specifically what it is that's why this is valuable. Isn't that a podcast?
Definitely. And what you're talking about with ingredients, once we have that initial podcast down, we can turn it into so many different things. I actually spoke at a conference last year, the DigiMarcon, where I went over all the different ways to repurpose. And I believe one podcast turned into 45 different pieces of content. That's going across all the podcast platforms. That's turning each one into 7 social media shorts, which, by the way, it can even be more than that. Turning it into a blog, which, by the way, it could even be turned into more blogs. Having it, now I have mine as like a LinkedIn newsletter. You can have it as like sending it out to your actual newsletter, to your list. There's so many different ways, there's so many different things you can turn it into. And I think this is so important to mention, specifically in the age of AI, is that we start with the real content, that there's not like, some hocus pocus, whatever. We have the real stuff. And because that is so attractive and because it's so real and we know it's valuable and it's coming from us and from an expert, that now we are cool to push this in all the different realms. But it has to start from real ingredients, from real experts.
Let me tell you one of my favorite ways, Danny, to repurpose content. So Marco Cipolla, who's like a Danny, but he's, instead of in pest control, he's done it for these concrete coating companies. He has grown his agency to a couple $1 million a year, right? Successfully following this program we talked about. And he had me on his podcast to talk about how you as a home service business can own your own marketing, right? It was a great 1-hour episode. We had 5 tips. We went through each of these tips, well structured. But then not only did we repurpose into articles and videos and all that kind of stuff, which I have some websites that have a lot of power, so if we put it on those websites, then he ranks and there's all kinds of SEO benefit. But we also reframed it from different points of view. Now, when I'm on his podcast, he's the host, and he's asking me questions, and he's driving the thing, which is what happened. But we repurposed it so that, using AI, but starting with raw ingredients, from my point of view, on how if you're a home service business and you're working with agencies, here's some things. So I went to the AI and I said, ChatGPT, I said, take this episode where Marco is the host, but repurpose it so we're writing an article from my point of view, coaching a lot of young adults or whatnot on what that home service business needs to know. And so it's the same raw ingredients, but spun from a different angle. Now spin it from the angle of, as a blog post, if you are a plumber, what are things that you need to know based on what we'd already discussed? Now pull in the episode, this is what I actually did. Pull in the episode of me and Danny called The New Era of SEO, where we talk about EEAT and all these things and how to rank and how AI is changing things. Add that in and now enrich that article on what does a plumber actually need to know about SEO. Now pull in stuff where Roger Wakefield and I have talked about this and enrich that article. So that derivative piece of content is actually made from multiple sources of raw ingredients. A lot of people think you've got a YouTube video, you can chop it up into 7 or 8 different things. That one source can be chopped up into many things, yes. But have you thought there's many videos that you've made, many guests that you have, and then you could say this topic A, was covered in this part of video A, this part of video, and I can pull from all the different things and reassemble anytime we've talked about whatever that topic is, right?
Yeah.
How much kind of derivative content can you make that's beyond just repurposing only ingredients from one video?
Yeah, and it comes back to having kind of a good amount of content to pull from. So now that I've done, I mean, this might be episode 45 or so,
yeah.
I have so much content to pull from. And you know, what Dennis is talking about might sound super advanced to you, and you might not do that until like a year or two into podcasting. And that's totally cool. And you know, my podcast is certainly not perfect, but what's great about it is that now I have so much content to pull from that, you know, now I've had some of these top experts, and you know, we're going to start short form soon, and all the short form clips can be taken from all the great existing podcasts instead of, oh, okay, well now I can just do it for the new ones. It's, you know, you can pull from this content forever. It's evergreen and it's everlasting. So absolutely love it. And then one other thing I'd like to touch on is some people might actually have a podcast and I don't know, maybe they have 10 or 20 episodes, you know, they've got some content out there. They've got a little foot in the door, but what are people missing in terms of podcasting? What are most podcasters getting wrong?
They think it's just about checking the numbers down the list and playing buzzword bingo to be able to interview all these names. I know this because I'm one of the boxes that check for digital marketing, right? And I see these folks reach out and they're like, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast. I've already had these other people in digital marketing, and to get bingo, I need to have you and like
bingo.
Ryan Davis, or I don't know, whoever it is, right? And so I'm like, okay, I'll do that. But when it becomes this mechanical, like, oh, every Thursday I need to like have I need to schedule this thing out, you lose the heart, you lose kind of the inspiration, because it's like, oh, dang it, I gotta do my laundry this Sunday, right? Yeah. But instead of just trying to like do as many episodes as possible, literally think about, how do I make the most of what I've already got? I'm a quality versus quantity guy, because now everyone's jumped into podcasting. It wasn't like it was a few years ago, but I see people who have, like, I get it, like, get to 100, you want to get to 100 episodes or whatnot, you're like episode 85. Have you seen these people? I won't name names, but this one guy said, yeah, I'm doing like 5 podcasts a day because I'm going to do another 100 podcasts in the month of February. What kind of quality do you think that's going to be?
Really low.
I mean, you could be a Sean Kelly, where you're interviewing all these other people about social media, but you lose a little bit of that. Like, I was with Sean Kelly in his video studio, and he told me he had 8 podcasts that day. He was literally in there the whole day. I don't know, he's so skinny. I bet you didn't have time to eat, because it was just like one guest to the next guest. And I happened to be one of those on his podcast, which is super cool. Like, who wouldn't want to be on Sean Kelly's podcast, right? But then I was watching him do these episodes after episodes, and he was just rushing through. And I love Sean Kelly, right? I help him with personal branding and this kind of stuff. That's like when you take things too far. So yes, I love people getting their episodes out there, but do the work in between. If you need to slow it down to have like 1 episode a month, or if you just don't have anything for 3 months, that's okay. Because what matters, just like with how often should you write a blog post, or how often should you do whatever, the thing is not, you should do one every Thursday, or twice a week, or how often should you post on Twitter? Yeah. No, the correct answer is, when you have something of quality worth sharing, that governs the frequency. Not like, I need to do 2 per week now. Like, we were with somebody who you and I know in Dallas, and he said, I'm going to step it up to 2 podcasts per week now. Like, I don't think you're going to get twice as much revenue off of 2 per week, because you're losing the heart. It's like a girl having, turning as many jobs as she can. Like, that's not what we're trying to do here as podcast hosts.
Yeah, and also you kind of have that scarcity effect where, I mean, how good can it be if you're putting out one every single day? Yeah. Versus if you just, like, usually a great schedule is weekly. I don't know, you might want to do monthly. I like to stick to weekly. Is that, it's a pretty big guest every time. Versus if I put out 3 podcasts a day, I don't think people would watch them much less. Yeah. Because, I mean, how many guests can I have, especially if it's a niche topic, which you should do? Yeah. I mean, how many people can I have in local marketing? There's a select few. Maybe there's 1,000 people. Yeah. I mean, once I hit those 1,000, I mean, what else do I do? So that's a great point as well. Really, I've seen that a lot, actually, that people see the podcast as more of a chore. So I think, first off, you have to understand the benefits, and you have to get into it to even get to that point. Yeah. But stop looking at it as a chore. See it from these other kind of frames and different lenses like we've talked about of it's free coaching. These are, forever relationships that you can establish. Like, this is a great thing. I love podcasting, and I believe it's a really great opportunity that other people should get into as well. And I've got one more question for you, Dennis. Maybe I'll think of another, but in terms of more advanced podcasting stuff now, something that you mentioned earlier was that you can guarantee someone 10,000 views on a show. Now, I feel like most people listening to that, they're like, dude, what are you even talking about? How do I guarantee that? Whatever. Can you touch more on that?
So when you are interviewing someone who's a big deal, then the basic rules kind of don't apply, right? If you're interviewing someone who's not that big of a deal, maybe well known in a very, very niche thing, you don't have to do these other things that show authority because they'll just say yes to be polite, because anyone, like even Gary Vaynerchuk will probably say yes to you if you have a 5-minute thing, right? But if you want someone who is maybe not like an Elon Musk or Richard Branson, but someone who's like pretty well known, and they're like, and then the gap between where you are and where they are is big, then you need to show them some kind of value. And the easiest way to do that is to say, I can promise you that you'll get at least 10,000 views on this. And how can you do that if you're nobody? How can you do that in advance of whether it's, you can't guarantee something's gonna go viral. But what you do is, if that person is a big deal, then you can target them on Twitter and on Facebook and TikTok and whatnot, and literally pay for, I choose post engagement. So when it's a boosted post, it's part of my $1 a day strategy, it's one component of this. But usually, a view, depending on what the channel, will cost between 1 penny and 5 cents. So if you want, let's say it's a penny, then 10,000 views is $100. So are you willing to spend $100 to make sure that that episode is seen? And most of my friends who have podcasts, Danny, they do not boost posts. You went to all this effort to film this thing, to prepare the value of their time and your time, and to repurpose it and edit it and all that. Like, if you're doing it right, you're probably already $300 or $400 in, not even counting the value of your time. People like working on your stuff. And so is it not worth $100? Like, how many times, Danny, do you see like someone who asks, hey, can I be on your podcast? And then you of course you look them up to see who they are. And you look at their YouTube and it's like 12 views and 7 views. And it's like, do you want to be on that? Then it's like very obvious they're just using it for private coaching, or even worse, they don't really know what they're doing because they just heard someone else say you should have a podcast, so they just started. But then you look at their stuff, and their total channel views is 532 views across 52 videos. They've done a video every week for the last year, 52 videos, 75 hard, whatever it is, right? Every day I've been doing it, but no one's watching any of your stuff, even though it's with well-known guests. When you boost that post, especially on YouTube and on Twitter, and that content's good, and it follows the items that we talked about, clear value proposition with that guest who's well known, with the, aligns with what you both do, then it's going to attract more of the kind of views that you want. And like, I have the #1 article on Influencive. Influencive is the top site for influencers. And so Grant Cardone and Tony Robbins and all these, Mark Lack, all these guys are publishing on Influencive. But what I've done is I've sent $1 a day traffic to my episodes and videos and whatever that I put there, so that, because the algorithm on that site, Influencive, is looking at who's gotten the most traffic and puts them at the top in the top 10 articles to show, right? When people want to learn how to be an influencer. And so if I see I've fallen down, then I'll put a little more money against it to push myself up to #1. So I'm always there on the home page and getting more traffic. And the thing is, if you have a great episode, like I think the one that we did on the new era of SEO, we did that timeless. That'll still be valuable in 2030. Even more so with all this AI, this and that, right? So I can put money against that episode, even if it's not my channel. I can feature it, because in your YouTube, you can show featured videos that aren't just your videos. People don't know that. It could be anywhere you've interviewed. It could be some random video, right? And that continues to drive algorithm power, instead of relying upon organic only to give you a few views for however long. I understand like YouTube is like, will still continue to build, but on any other social network, you get traffic for 24 hours maybe, and then it kind of falls off the feed. But $1 a day is how you can tell that guest, hey, I'm honoring you, I'm doing my research, I'm guaranteeing you 10,000 views. In other words, I'm willing to put a couple $100 against it. And most of you guys who have podcasts don't do that, which is a shame. It looks bad for future guests that want to potentially be on your thing, and they'll say no because they look you up and they're like, that tweet didn't get much, that Facebook post. You can boost Facebook posts too if you turn it into professional mode and then boost it for $1 a day for 7 days, $7. Can you not afford $7 to honor that guest? Or to go back to episodes that you had from years ago and honor those? I do that all the time.
Yeah.
I don't have to produce any more content at all for the rest of my life. I can rely solely upon any content I've already created because I can go back and boost those posts.
Yeah, so awesome. Guys, like, I don't know if you know about Dennis, you probably know about the $1 a day strategy. It's really incredible, and it's actually really simple. We were talking about this a few days ago that, I mean, it's just like you were saying, that podcast episode, that strategy of $1 a day is timeless. It can be applied to anything. Overall, it's a testing strategy. And if you want to learn more about it, you should either get his course or look at I believe it's the second podcast that we did, which is how to do Facebook ads. And again, that's $1 a day particularly for Facebook, but again, that applies to any other platform. So awesome. I've got one more question for you, and then we'll wrap it up, is how do we interview people successfully? Like what questions should we be asking? What should the format be? Like, is there a specific intro, outro, middle? How exactly do you go about creating a successful interview?
So there's a few components to having a successful interview. The first is you have to have a core theme or problem that you're solving, which also ties to the hook of why you're bringing people in. Michael Stelzner, I think, is the very best at being able to interview other people who are high-profile experts and entrepreneurs. Because he'll say, and you can see this, you can do a search on Facebook $1 a day, Social Media Examiner, which is the #1 site for social media marketers. And he'll say, guys, in today's episode, we're talking with Dennis Yu on the $1 a day method and how you can use $1 to be able to do this and that. Welcome, Dennis, blah, 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 right? Because that sets it up very clear. $1 a day, entrepreneurs amplifying what's working, optimizing, right? So if you know why you want to interview that particular guest, what their expertise is, and you honor them, then that already sets up the frame. Then come up with 5 or 6 questions. Perhaps ChatGPT can help you with that, but that doesn't replace the expertise and time that you have to put in to research them. I'm guilty because often it'll be like the day before I'm interviewing somebody and I procrastinated because I always look at my calendar for the next day. I'm like, oh crap, I'm interviewing so-and-so. I'm gonna have to stay up. It's already like midnight.
No, I
gotta stay up for like an hour or two and like watch all these YouTubes, right? Because if I try to do it the day of, that's just too much pressure, not enough time. I need the evening. For some reason, like watching their podcasts or whatever, because the best thing is to watch the last 3 podcasts they were on.
Yeah.
Watching that and then letting your brain marinate when you're sleeping somehow, and like let your brain subconscious kind of digest, makes you better prepared. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems true for me. Yeah. Right? And then when you go through that, be sure you're there early. So you don't have these AV issues. You never want them to show up on the Zoom or be at the office or wherever it is before you get there. That's just a bad look.
Yeah.
And then roll the cameras the whole time. Roll the cameras before you even technically start as part of the testing. That way you have a good vibe. You need to have good energy. Most of you guys that ruin a good podcast, even though you follow the steps, you don't have the good energy. Most people can't keep the energy up for 15 or 20 minutes. People like Danny can go for an hour or whatnot, right? Which is fine. Most people, like, past 45 minutes, they're already dead, right? Here's my #1 tip. At the end of the podcast, after the whole like, hey guys, this is great having, Danny Leibrandt on the podcast. How can people find you? Tune in next time for another edition of blah, blah, blah. Cut, right? Yeah. That's when you then say, okay, now we're gonna go back and forth with one-liners talking about why you should tune into this episode. So you record the intro at the end because you've already had the discussion. You already have hyped up the energy level. And that's when I might say, for this episode, guys, if you want to learn how a podcast can grow your local service business in ways you haven't anticipated, tune into what Danny and I just talked about in front of the Great Pyramids, right? And that could be a great hook. Yeah. But recorded at the end because we've already gone through this whole discussion. And then other pieces are you follow up. So we have a process where we use our Calendly and Infusionsoft integrated. There's all kinds of fancy things that you can do to be able to have a process where you say, hey guest, like, hey, automatic reminders, your podcast is tomorrow, all that kind of, here's what you need to prepare, right? But one of the things that we build in, which Josh Nelson learned from us too, is we send them a pair of socks with their face on it, right? And it's actually better if you do it before they become a guest on your podcast, because then it's all about that energy in the very beginning, right? They'll say like, dude, I'm so excited to be on your podcast because, you know, yesterday my wife, when she opened up the mail, she saw a pair of socks and had my face on it. At first it was creepy, but then I read the note and it said it's from Dennis. And like, oh, okay, that is so cool, look, right? And then they tag me on social media. So it just starts off with a really good vibe. Especially, I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're a big deal or not, because then what you really want, the whole thing of what I'm saying here is establish the vibe of the friendship, the energy. It's very hard to show this. I mean, you can see like Danny and I are friends, you know, because we're like, how often do you meet someone in Egypt, right? We're not wearing our name tags at a conference. If there's a name tag at the conference, it's very clear, like
red flag.
But you're trying to establish that you're actually friends with them. And you know, that's why I like to do stuff. Like I interviewed last month a guy who does $3 billion in sales.
Wow.
Hedge fund guy, right? And he said, cool, you know, I've got a podcast studio in one of our offices. We can go there and this and that and have all the film crew ready. Because he wanted to treat it really serious, because we were both speakers at a conference. And I told him after we were both there, I'm like, dude, I would love to have you on my podcast, right? But instead, I said, no, let's not do the podcast studio. Let's do it at your house, right? It's like, I know, but my house is still being built and they're still like constructing all this and that. I'm like, that's totally cool. We'll just do it in your kitchen, right? I'll just set it up just like we did here. But why do you think I would choose that versus like being in the fancy studio?
Because it's more natural.
Yeah. And it's like the dog is running around and his wife like comes into the background. Oh, whoops, honey, I didn't realize you guys were doing a podcast episode. And I love that, right? Because it shows this level of authenticity. It shows a level of energy that people really crave, because now they're like distrustful. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's a sales pitch. Like the lighting's too good. It looks like an advertisement. So all of these things are how the way to have a good podcast is, all these tips are establishing the good vibe.
So good. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Dennis Yu. I think this is an awesome podcast. I really don't know how anyone can top a podcast talking about podcasts. I think this one was incredible. Really great show here, guys. If you enjoyed it, please like and comment and subscribe. Let me know what you think about the show. Leave a review if you're listening on podcast platforms. And Dennis, where can people find you, learn more about you, find out about your services and all that stuff?
You can Google me, Dennis space YU, and if you want to connect on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, whatever it is, check out these great pyramids here.